Russia has responded to NATO's crossing of its red line, in particular with regard to the green lighting of US and NATO weapons being used or to be used on Russian territory. Now, this has come amid reports also that NATO is preparing a plan to deploy hundreds of thousands of US troops quickly to the Russian border to confront Russia should Russia, as they say with China, right? Should Russia invade NATO, well, China, of course, is always told is going to invade Taiwan. But Putin has responded. Russia has responded. And here is what Putin had to say. Putin outlines Russian response to long-range missile strikes. Moscow is considering arming adversaries of the West in sensitive areas. Russia is considering asymmetric measures against Kiev's sponsors due to Ukraine's use of Western-supplied weapons against its territory, Russian President Vladimir Putin has said. The Russian leader's remarks came at a meeting with the heads of international news agencies on Wednesday on the sidelines of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. We have no illusions in this regard, said Putin, repeating his prior comments that Ukrainian troops might be pulling the trigger, but the U.S. and its allies are providing intelligence and targeting information. Russia will respond by boosting air defenses and destroying these missiles, Putin said. Secondly, if someone deems it is possible to supply such weapons to the war zone to strike our territory, why shouldn't we supply similar weapons to those regions of the world where they will be used against sensitive sites of these countries, the Russian president added. We can respond asymmetrically. We will give it a thought. All right. So he said also, we will completely destroy international relations, or it will completely destroy international relations and undermine international security. That is what Putin said. If we see that these countries are being drawn into a war against us, and this is their direct participation in the war against Russia, then we reserve to act in a similar way. This is a recipe for serious problems. So Vladimir Putin has basically said, he's laying down the gauntlet, that not only, and I believe he's saying two things here. He's saying, one, asymmetric responses. Wherever these weapons are being supplied, wherever there's training, wherever that is happening, why can't Russia sponsor and arm forces that are against that? Why can't they use their military arsenal to sponsor forces that will make it very difficult for these NATO countries to operate, to conduct, to allow for these forces and these weapons to be used at all? And then I think he's also saying that should it escalate to this degree, should it escalate to the degree where there are these weapons in a long-range manner hitting Russian military assets and Russian territory, and I believe he's talking about deeper than just Belgorod and right above that Kharkov border line. I believe he's talking about far more than that, that he's talking about that this could be missile strikes all across Russian territory, as long-range missiles have certain capabilities, ATACMS, etc. So I believe he's also saying that this could lead to Russia hitting those NATO countries should that happen. That's the problems that he is citing, because that is ultimately what the laws of war would dictate. That would be a very measured and reasonable response, except it would mean doomsday. It would mean the doomsday scenario, that second to midnight doomsday clock that we are really on the cusp of, would strike midnight, and we would have a nuclear proliferation scenario, a nuclear conflict very much and rapidly occurring. Now, I want to show you now, okay, what Putin had to say about plans to attack NATO, because a lot of this has to do with the idea that Russia's not going to stop at Ukraine. We have to bring the war to Russia, because not only is Ukraine bogged down, not only is Ukraine in big trouble, but we have to bring the war to Russia to stop it from invading NATO in the future. That's what these plans, these corridors are supposedly about. In real time, in the real world, what we're actually talking about is NATO preparing for war with Russia. This is just a propaganda smokescreen to say, well, Russia wants to invade NATO. Why? Because Russia continuously says and never acts in a manner. So it's not just about what Putin says here, which is important, but also Russia never acts in a manner that could make you think that it's going to invade NATO. Even if you took the assumption that Ukraine was invaded by Russia, which many have argued that actually it has been intervening on behalf of the Donbass and Russian speakers and Russian people in eastern Ukraine during a really brutal military campaign led by NATO and its proxy government of Ukraine since 2014, the coup government. That ever since then, Russia has seen it as a necessity to protect these people who have such a deep relationship to Russia. Well, if you subscribe to the other narrative, the Western narrative that Russia invaded Ukraine, well, Ukraine's not a NATO member. So you can't say that that behavior has anything to do with a bigger plan to invade NATO. But nonetheless, here's what Putin had to say. It's bull, Putin, on plans to attack NATO. The idea that Moscow has some kind of plan to attack NATO is a stupid attempt to maintain West's global hegemony by fear. Putin was asked about NATO's preparations to defend from a Russian invasion at a meeting with the head of international news agencies, again at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. Look, someone has imagined that Russia wants to attack NATO. Have you gone completely insane? Are you as thick as two short planks? Who came up with this nonsense, this bull? The Russian president suggested that this bull was in service of deceiving Western public, urging them to send more weapons to Ukraine. Why is this being done? Really, to maintain their own positions of greatness. That's why there's nothing to these scare stories intended for the townsfolk in Germany and France and elsewhere in Europe. In Ukraine, we're just protecting ourselves. Don't make up things and then form opinions about Russia on the basis of them. You only hurt yourself in that way. So that was what Vladimir Putin had to say to this. Now, I want to show you how a friend of the show, Scott Ritter, reacted to this on Judge Napolitano's show. But first, before I do that, okay, I will show you how Colonel Douglas McGregor reported this development on corridors, okay, from the Telegraph. It says NATO is now planning to get U.S. troops to the front line to fight Russia. What are they thinking? NATO has disclosed its preparations to deploy American troops to the European front lines in the event of a full-scale conflict with Russia. Innovative land corridors are being established to expedite movement of soldiers through Central Europe, bypassing bureaucratic hurdles. This strategic setup enables NATO forces to swiftly react should Putin's aggressive actions in Ukraine extend westward. Reports suggest that these plans also encompass provisions for potential Russian attacks. In such scenarios, troops could mobilize through corridors in Italy, Greece, and Turkey to reach the Balkans, or alternatively advance towards Russia's northern border via Scandinavia. And here's the map that was shared, okay, at how this would occur. U.S. forces airlifted into NATO countries, then taking these corridors straight through bureaucratic hurdles. And now look at Turkey. I do believe that if Turkey were to be involved in this way, that we would see, I believe we would see the end of Turkey's membership into NATO, because I think popular pressure would not allow this. This is an absolutely insane plan to try to mobilize a coherent NATO strategy for war with Russia. And they always say in the event of a potential invasion, but guess what? There is no potential invasion of NATO. Russia has absolutely no interest. What would compel Russia? And I'm going to play how Scott Ritter responded to all of this. What would compel Russia to do this? Absolutely nothing. This is complete fantasy. This is NATO gone wild. You might have remembered those commercials, those really horrific exploitative commercials of young girls, right, taken on video as they were partying or whatnot, and then it was distributed to the public. Well, this is NATO's version of this. They have gone wild. They are publicly announcing all of these ridiculous plans, these horrific plans that would lead to World War III, and all of them essentially amount to desperation. One, that if Russia's actions are taken into consideration, there's absolutely no basis for this. But we will talk about what the real basis for this is after we hear Scott Ritter. So here we go.
Sullivan, Austin, etc., President, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of Defense, understand the gravity of this moment as you've explained it? Or are they just propagandists?
You know, I used to have a friend named William Polk, and I say used to because tragically he passed away a couple of years ago. But William Polk was a man who was in the inner circle for John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he talks about, and he's talked to me many times about the decision making that was going on and the role that Kennedy played in preventing a nuclear war, the maturity Kennedy had as a leader. Part of that maturity came from when Kennedy was first briefed on what was then called the Single Integrated Operation Plan, the PSYOP, the American War Plan. He went to the Pentagon and they briefed him. They said, this is, if we go to nuclear war, this is what we got. And basically, it was premised on the notion that America will be the largest surviving civilization, but in order to guarantee that, we have to kill everybody in the world. And he came out and said, that's insane. I'm not doing that. And he turned to his advisor, he said, and we call ourselves the human race. And he said, you have to give me options. Every president since then, or up until George W. Bush, reacted the same way. When they first got that briefing on how America plans to go to war, which is to destroy the entire world so that when the 20 to 30% of America that survives will be the largest remaining civilization cluster in the world, guaranteeing American global dominance in a post-nuclear conflict. Insanity. They all said the same thing. Insane. Give me options. I can't go to that. You can't make me do this. You have to give me options. And the Pentagon always gave them options that inevitably led to that. Since the end of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Americans have downplayed their nuclear war plan. We detargeted our missiles. Nothing was automatic anymore. We were heading in a path of, getting rid of nuclear weapons. And then George W. Bush came in a post 9/11 environment and said, we will use our nuclear weapons to ensure that a 9/11 never happens again. And we reinserted nuclear war planning into our military doctrine. And today we have that same mindset, that same nuclear war strategy without the maturity of John F. Kennedy. We have people who look at the plan and say, well, that's just a plan. We're not really going to do that. And they say the Russians are bluffing. We don't have to worry about this. The problem is the second something happens and that plan is pulled out, the dust is blushed off, and we start pushing buttons, we go to the scenario that John F. Kennedy said was insanity. Judge, we're going to blow up the entire world because we know that in a post-nuclear environment, we can't allow, for instance, India to survive intact because we're going to be reduced to 30% of our capacity. We can't allow India to have a superior civilization in a post-nuclear conflict. We're going to destroy the entire world. That's what the American nuclear war plan is. And the American people need to wake up and understand it's on full automatic. Full automatic.
Yeah. So, I mean, that is ultimately what this is leading to when NATO announces these plans, when there is this talk, these leaks that come out about NATO and what it is planning to do around a kinetic war, a direct confrontation with Russia. What that leads to is the nuclear scenario, and what it leads to is exactly what was delineated there. It leads to a cascading of events, of moves, which are why we have this doomsday clock that says seconds to midnight, and why U.S. wars put us into that just unthinkable red zone. So that is ultimately where things are going. And and I think Scott is exactly right. It is all about bluster from the U.S. side, believing that Russia is bluffing and believing that it has the ability to confidently walk around with this insane policy of aggression with Russia, because it believes that it is Russia that will be restrained. Well, Russia has every right to defend itself. If it believes it is under the threat of nuclear war, it will deploy its own. It will defend itself. We are seeing that Russia is showing us. I've covered it on this channel, not just with tactical nuclear weapons drills, but also with the potential launch of a strategic nuclear weapon on a testing site to show NATO and show the world that these weapons exist in Russia's arsenal. All of that are messages to say that Russia is not bluffing. But the thing is that Russia has only one goal here, and this is what the big problem is, because Russia's goal is to defend itself. China's goal, Scott mentioned India there, China would face the same fate if there was a nuclear conflict precipitated by NATO against Russia. then of course China would also find itself under the gun, because under this doctrine, China would not be allowed to exist in a post-nuclear war with better capabilities than the United States at that level. So all this is to say is that, of course, the whole world is at risk. But the fact of the matter is that the United States is really playing with fire. Right? You have Russia, who has said it is not bluffing. And it said it's not bluffing under the auspices and context of a policy of defense, of self-defense, of national, so-called national security, as we often call it. But really what we're talking about is defense of sovereignty. That's how Russia has operated. This is the big problem here, is that the United States and NATO are viewing Russia from the view that it is an offensive force, that it is taking a posture antithetical and in conflict with the United States. And that is not just because of Russia's military capabilities, its might, and its threat to U.S. primacy, which, mind you, is ridiculous given the fact that Russia does not expand beyond its own borders. You heard what Putin said about NATO. Where does Russia have military installations along the NATO sphere? Nowhere. It wasn't until 2022 where Russia took decisive action in special military operation to defend the forces with relationships to Russia along its own border against Ukraine and NATO-sponsored genocide of the people of the Donbass. It wasn't until 2022 when that happened. It wasn't until 2015 when Russia gave support to Syria to fight the U.S.-backed, Israeli-backed, Saudi-backed, etc. proxies, ISIS, etc. to in Syria. It wasn't until 2015, but Syria isn't a NATO country. Syria gave Russia permission. Where in the NATO sphere has Russia extended its tentacles? It doesn't exist. Russia has built economic relations, trade relations, certainly defense relations in some regard with Turkey, etc. But can you say that this is equivalent to attempting to expand, to create its own kind of a NATO-like treaty organization, a military organization led by Russia? No. Russia and China, they want increased integration, but they are not stomping on the world to get it. They are not putting countries under their thumbs to get that integration, to get that cooperation, to get those relations. It's a different form of working with others. It's multilateralism, it's multipolarity, it is coexisting, it is developing a world where prosperity, where trade, where development and infrastructure and the overall sovereignty of all countries is respected. That is the big problem here. That is the problem that Russia represents. This is why there is this conflict. This is why there are these plans. It has nothing to do whatsoever with any kind of expansive doctrine from Russia. So we're seeing the development of something very, very dangerous. We are seeing that this conflict in Ukraine is turning into something much bigger. It always was going to turn into this because it always had an element of major power confrontation, of this imperial order, this world order that is declining. It's in massive decline. It is turning into its opposite. This force for just dominance is now becoming a shell of itself because its control and grip over the political and economic trajectory of the world is waning. The U.S. economy is shrinking. NATO's economies, look at the European economies, look at the EU. It's essentially its brother and sister project, the EU. It is in shambles. It has leveled all these sanctions on Russia only to find that it has stagnated its own growth. Okay, so this is really the end of an epic, the epic of, or I should say epoch, if I'm to be less American about it, but the epoch that we have been all living under of Pax Americana, of U.S. hegemony, of the project for a new American century, of American exceptionalism, all of this is going away. The empire is falling, it is crumbling, it is declining. It, in just the next several decades, will not be able to maintain its economic primacy, and its military primacy is fast becoming all that it has left. And even there, it is finding that it doesn't matter. And this is what so many over the years, okay, have said, that it does, that all the technology in the world, all of the most dangerous weapons, all of the arms, all of the guns, they cannot suppress, they cannot destroy the ideas of people and the overall development of a more free, of a more liberated, of a more self-determined planet. And now we are finding that even those guns, those arms, that superior military capacity the United States has long championed is just not so superior after all. I mean, Afghanistan kicked the United States out quite rapidly, quite quickly in just a few decades. And when it did happen, it happened with extreme rapidity. We're talking about a massive embarrassment for the US empire. So all this is to say is that Putin is not bluffing, Russia is not bluffing, but Russia is not going to blow up the world. Russia is not going to be the party responsible for that. But the second that the United States, that NATO indicates that this conflict is on, that there is going to be a nuclear option on the table, that there is a move to directly intervene into Russia's affairs, onto Russian territory. When the United States and NATO present that scenario, you better believe Russia will respond. If the special military operation hasn't taught us anything, it's that no, Russia's not bluffing. Russia's willing to go as long as it takes to ensure, and as hard as it takes to ensure, that its sovereignty is respected. It just so happens to be in an almost checkmate position because Ukraine is essentially defeated and NATO is now scrambling for the next strategy, not the exit strategy, but the next strategy to contain and thwart Russia. Well, the big news here is that it's not going to work. It's not going to happen. And that is why we need to buckle up, because these doomsday scenarios are all made possible by the US's impudence, by the US empire's impotence, by its decline, its weakness. And in many ways, that is a good thing because a new world is in birth. But in many ways, it signals dangers that we cannot ignore. And this one, with regard to NATO and Russia, is perhaps the most important one in front of our eyes right now. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.